Why do these instruments insist on confusing the rest of us? Can't they just fall in line with the rest of civilized society and make the notes they play match the notes they read? I mean, they already get their spit all over the place. The least that they could do is save us the headache of transposition. Well, it turns out that even though it's annoying and confusing, transposition is done for some really good reasons. But first, what does it actually mean to transpose? To put it in the simplest terms, when playing a transposing instrument, the notes that you are seeing and the notes that are actually coming out of your instrument don't match. Instruments that transpose can be broken into two different categories: the easy ones and the hard ones. The easy ones transpose by the octave, and they do not change keys. My instrument, the bass for example, sounds an octave lower than the notes it reads on the page. And the reason for this is very straightforward. It makes the music easier to read for both the player and the conductor. It keeps the music on the page more organized, and it saves the transcriber and copyist from having to deal with ledger lines. This is what typical bass music would look like if it wasn't transposed. No thanks. The guitar, the electric bass, and the contrabassoon all do this as well. And there are instruments that do this in the other direction. The piccolo sounds an octave higher than it is written. The glockenspiel sounds 2 octaves higher. And this is done for the same reason as the lower instruments, to avoid ledger lines and to keep things neat. And that takes care of those. I'd argue that these transpositions make everyone's life easier: the players, the conductors, and the composers. But the hard ones do not. All of these instruments change keys when they transpose, which is where the headache begins for everyone, leaving the conductor's score looking like a calculus problem, with every other line in a different key. Out of all of the hard instruments, in my opinion, the horn takes the cake as the biggest headache of transposition, both because of its history and its modern design. Horns these days have it good, with all of those valves and extra tubing that allows them to play any note that they'd like within their range. But it wasn't always like that. Before the invention of the rotary valves in the 19th century, we had what were called natural horns. And these horns could only play the notes associated with the harmonic series of the fundamental that they were tuned to. So a horn with the fundamental of C could only play these notes. A horn in C would be most useful when the music is in the key of C. Duh. But it could also play some notes in closely related keys such as F and G. But as the music got further from the key of the fundamental of the horn became more and more useless. A C horn in A flat would be a doorstop instead of an instrument. In order to be more useful in more keys, natural horn players would change the crook of their horn, which would change the fundamental of their instrument, allowing them access to a different harmonic series. A horn with an E flat crook would be able to play these notes. Natural horn players would often be required to change crooks in the middle of a piece, and they would be expected to have access to crooks in many different keys. To make the horn players' lives easier, composers would always notate their natural horn parts in the key of C, so that the same notes on the page would always represent the same partial, regardless of what key they were playing in. But making this easier for the horn player to read meant that they would often be transposing in multiple keys across the same piece, making it more confusing for everybody else in the room. But once valves were invented, the horn could now play chromatically, and had no reason to use crooks, but they still transpose. Why? There are several reasons, but the biggest being that even when the chromatic horn was invented, all of the music that had been previously written for it was still in all of those crooked keys. The horn we use today is in F, but no matter what key they are in, they still have to transpose everything that was written for the natural horn, which includes all of the classical period and a large chunk of the romantic period. And unless somebody wants to go back through every piece of music that has ever been written for the natural horn and convert it to concert pitch, likely this transposition is not going away. But there are also other reasons outside of the repertoire. The F horn was chosen by composers because they liked the sound of the natural horn in F. But the reason that it still reads a fifth higher is because this range keeps it most similar to how it would have been notated in the natural horn days. No matter what key the natural horn was playing in, it would always be reading these notes. Sometimes those first two would be notated in bass clef. In order to keep horn music mostly in this range, transposition is needed. Here's what low horn music would look like if it wasn't transposed. It would be better off being written in alto or bass clef. And you could argue that they should just read bass clef in concert pitch, but that would require a complete overhaul of both the pedagogy and technique of the horn. But there's even another layer of complexity. F is the most common key for the horn, but professionals are expected to play the double horn, which is an instrument that is capable of switching from being pitched in F to being pitched in B flat. The reason for this is that in F, it is very difficult to play high because the partials are so close together, making even pro players likely to miss notes. The solution is to switch to a higher key when playing high so that those partials become further apart, which alleviates some of the accuracy issues in F. So the horn is a transposing instrument that transposes its transposed repertoire from the natural horn era, that also has the option to be transposed in B or F at any time. I have a headache. It works for them, just don't ask questions. And while we are on the topic of brass, much of what was said for the horn can also be said for the trumpet. They too had to use crooks and were very limited before the invention of valves, leading to many of the same transpositional issues in their repertoire. We won't go down that rabbit hole now, or else we'll be here all day, but they have similar stories. The Woodwind family faced some similar issues to the brass in the early days, just to a lesser extent. The clarinet, for example, was able to play diatonically, whereas the brass could only play harmonically. But the clarinet had issues playing chromatically, because of the rudimentary key system that those instruments had. Chromatic notes were difficult to execute, had a weaker tone, and were difficult to play in tune. To alleviate this, clarinets in different keys had to be produced. A clarinet in C would probably be fine in the keys of C, F, and G, but wouldn't fare very well in the key of A, so another clarinet would need to be made. And because clarinets and other woodwind instruments were expected to change the keys of their instruments so often, they needed a way to be able to use the same fingerings across different instruments. The problem is that if you finger a scale on an A clarinet and then use that same fingering on a B flat clarinet, what will pop out is two different scales. Without transposition, clarinetists would have to relearn fingering systems for every version of the clarinet that they played. They would need an A fingering system, and a B flat fingering system, and an E flat fingering system, etc. To fix this problem, we made it so that all clarinets, no matter what key they were in, would always read the same notes with the same fingering system. The only thing that would change is the actual note that comes out the end of their bells. Their fingerings are always in the same key, but the sound that comes out of the instrument is not. And people that are still arguing that this doesn't need to exist, I want you to think about the alternative in relation to your instrument. It's not uncommon for us to ask a clarinetist to play a B flat one week, an E flat soprano the next, and a bass clarinet the next. Now imagine if that applied to the strings. Imagine going up to a violinist and telling them that for next week's concert cycle, they will be playing the bass, which is an instrument that is 5 times the size, reads a different clef, has a different tuning system, and a different fingering system. This would be impossible on a professional level. Well, essentially, this is the position that we put woodwind players in sometimes. So we need to make the transition from instrument to instrument as easy as possible for them, and transposition is one of the ways that we do that. The other woodwinds are in similar positions. The flute plays in concert pitch, but the piccolo transposes an octave, and the alto flute is in G. The oboe plays in concert pitch, but the English horn transposes to F, again for the same reasons. And we come to nearly the same conclusion. It works for them, so don't ask questions. Sometimes, string players, such as myself, silently judge the mess that is transposition in the winds and brass section of the orchestra. We think we're above all that, but occasionally we play down in the mud as well. We just use a fancy word to cover it up. Scordatura, which in normal people speak is just a fancy way of saying we retune our strings. But the problem is when we change the tuning of our strings, we essentially end up playing a different instrument. All of our training on our instrument is about navigating the fingerboard with the assumption that the intervals are always consistent between the strings, fifths for violin, viola, and cello, and fourths for basses, and that all of our notes are always in the same places. When those intervals between the strings change, all of that training goes out the window, and we have to completely change the way that we play our instrument. Our solution to this, just like the winds, is to make our instrument a transposing one, so that we are able to keep all of our fingerings consistent even when the intervals between our strings change. A great example of this is the Fifth Cello Suite from Bach. He instructs the cello to tune their A string down to a G to make some more chords and ornaments more playable. And in doing that, he makes the cello a transposing instrument. Any note that is meant to be played on the A string is now written a whole step higher than it is actually played. Now, it's vitally important that none of you tell the winds about this. We can't have them knowing that we contribute to this mess. So there's your complicated answer to a complicated question. The system is not perfect, but it works for the instruments that have to deal with it. If you play a concert-pitched instrument, just be grateful you don't have to be a part of the madness. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, where you can get early and ad-free access to all my videos for just $2 a month. Thanks.